The Wyoming wind howled across the barren plains, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another harsh winter. Jacob Harrison stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, his calloused hands gripping the wooden railing as he watched the dust cloud approaching on the horizon. At 42, he had grown accustomed to solitude, but the emptiness of his life had become unbearable. The ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations felt more like a prison than a home. The decision to seek a bride through unconventional means hadn't come easily. After years of failed relationships and the increasing isolation of rural life, Jacob had turned to a shadowy network that promised companionship for those willing to pay the price. The arrangement was simple, brutal, and completely legal under the guise of a marriage contract. He had paid $15,000 for what was essentially a human being, and the weight of that transaction sat heavy on his conscience. The black sedan pulled up to the front of the house, its engine cutting through the silence like a blade. Jacob straightened his shoulders, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. He had expected someone older, someone who had chosen this path willingly. What he hadn't expected was the fragile figure that emerged from the back seat. She couldn't have been more than 15, maybe 16 at most. Her dark hair hung in limp strands around a face that bore the unmistakable signs of malnutrition and neglect. Her clothes were too small, obviously second-hand, and her shoes were worn thin at the soles. But it was her eyes that stopped Jacob cold, dark, hollow, and filled with a resignation that no child should ever possess. "Mr. Harrison?" The driver, a thin man with gold teeth and a nervous smile, approached with a manila envelope. "Everything's in order. Marriage certificate, identification documents, the works. She's all yours now." Jacob took the envelope with shaking hands, his eyes never leaving the girl who stood beside the car like a statue. She hadn't spoken, hadn't even looked at him directly. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "What's her name?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah," the driver replied. "Sarah Chen. Her mother signed all the papers, said she couldn't afford to keep her anymore." He chuckled darkly. "You got yourself a good deal, Mr. Harrison, young, healthy, and she knows her place." The casual cruelty of the man's words made Jacob's stomach turn. He wanted to demand more information, to understand how a mother could sell her own child, but the driver was already climbing back into his car. "Remember," the man called out through the window, "she's legally bound to you now. No running away, no complaints. You paid good money for her." The sedan disappeared in another cloud of dust, leaving Jacob alone with his purchase. For several minutes neither of them moved. The wind continued its mournful song across the plains, and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Finally, Jacob found his voice. "Sarah," he said gently. She flinched at the sound of her name, her shoulders hunching as if expecting a blow. When she finally looked up at him, Jacob saw fear mixed with defiance in her dark eyes. She was preparing herself for whatever was to come, steeling herself against the inevitable. "I'm Jacob," he continued, taking a careful step closer. This is your home now." She said nothing, but her eyes darted toward the house, taking in the peeling paint and sagging shutters. It wasn't much to look at, but it was solid and warm, and it was better than wherever she had come from. "Are you hungry?" Jacob asked, a barely perceptible nod. "Come on then," he said, gesturing toward the front door. "Let's get you something to eat." She followed him at a distance, like a wary animal that had been trapped but not yet tamed. The inside of the house was spartanly furnished but clean. Jacob led her to the kitchen, where he busied himself preparing a simple meal of soup and bread. She sat at the small table, her hands folded in her lap, watching his every movement. "I know this isn't what you wanted," Jacob said as he placed a bowl in front of her. "Hell, it's not what I wanted either. But here we are." She stared at the food for a long moment before picking up the spoon with trembling hands. She ate slowly, methodically, as if she wasn't sure when her next meal might come. "Where are you from?" Jacob asked, settling into the chair across from her. Silence. "How old are you?" More silence. Jacob sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Look, Sarah, I'm not going to hurt you. I know you probably don't believe that, but it's true. I'm not a monster, even if what I did makes me seem like one." She finished the soup and set the spoon down carefully, her eyes still fixed on the table. "So you don't have to talk if you don't want to," Jacob continued, "but this is going to be a lot easier if we can at least try to understand each other." For the first time since her arrival, Sarah looked directly at him. Her eyes were intelligent and searching, as if she were trying to read his intentions. Jacob held her gaze, letting her see whatever she needed to see. "I've got a spare room upstairs," he said finally. It's not much, but it's got a bed and a window. You can have some privacy there. He stood and walked to the staircase, pausing at the bottom step. Come on, I'll show you. The room was small but clean, with a single bed covered by a handmade quilt and a dresser that had seen better days. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. There's a bathroom at the end of the hall, Jacob said. Towels are in the closet. If you need anything, just let me know. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. Why? She asked, and the sound of it hit him like a physical blow. It was the first word she had spoken, and it carried the weight of every question she couldn't ask. Why had her mother sold her? Why had he bought her? Why was this her life? Jacob turned back to face her, seeing the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide. I don't know, he said honestly. I guess we're both just trying to survive in our own way. She nodded slowly, and something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. Get some rest, Jacob said. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next. As he closed the door behind him, Jacob leaned against the hallway wall and closed his eyes. What had he done? What kind of man paid money for a child bride? The questions tormented him as he made his way downstairs, but there were no easy answers. That night, as he lay in his own bed staring at the ceiling, Jacob could hear the faint sound of crying from the room upstairs. The sound broke something inside him, a part of his heart that he had thought was already dead. He had bought her freedom from whatever hell she had been living in, but he had also brought her into a new kind of prison. The next morning, Jacob woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. He found Sarah in the kitchen, standing at the stove with her back to him. She had changed into one of his old shirts which hung on her small frame like a dress. You didn't have to cook, he said. She turned to face him, and he saw that her eyes were red from crying. But there was something else there too, a quiet determination. I need to earn my keep, she said simply. The words stung because they revealed how she saw herself, how she had been taught to see herself, not as a person with inherent worth, but as a commodity that needed to justify its existence. You don't need to earn anything, Jacob said firmly. You're not a servant here. She looked at him with confusion, as if the concept of existing without constantly proving her value was foreign to her. Then what am I? She asked. It was a question that would haunt them both in the days to come. What was she? A wife, a ward, a victim, a survivor? The legal documents in the manila envelope said one thing, but the reality was far more complicated. Jacob poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, watching as Sarah served him breakfast with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing domestic work for years. She had learned to anticipate needs, to make herself useful, to become invisible when necessary. Tell me about your mother, Jacob said gently. Sarah's hand stilled on the serving spoon. What do you want to know? Why did she make this arrangement? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Jacob began to think she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said I was too expensive to keep, that this was my only chance at a better life. The casual cruelty of it made Jacob's blood run cold. He wanted to rage against the woman who had sold her own daughter, but he could see that Sarah was still defending her mother in her own way, still trying to make sense of the betrayal. And you believed her? Sarah shrugged. What choice did I have? She was all I had. The breakfast passed in relative silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the oppressive silence of fear, but the contemplative silence of two people trying to understand their situation. After breakfast, Jacob showed Sarah around the ranch. The property was vast but understaffed, with more work than one man could handle. The cattle grazed in distant pastures, and the barn needed repairs that Jacob had been putting off for months. It's not much, Jacob said as they walked, but it's honest work. The land provides for those who take care of it. Sarah listened without comment, but he could see her taking in everything. The condition of the fences, the state of the equipment, the endless horizon that stretched in every direction. Have you ever lived on a ranch before? Jacob asked. She shook her head. We lived in the city, in a small apartment with too many people. Family, my mother, my stepfather, and his kids. Sometimes other people too, people who needed a place to stay. She paused, seeming to consider whether to continue. My mother worked a lot of jobs, cleaning offices, stocking shelves, whatever she could find. It was never enough. Jacob could picture it. The crowded apartment, the constant struggle to make ends meet, the desperation that led to impossible choices. He had grown up with privilege compared to that, even if his childhood hadn't been easy. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Sarah looked at him with surprise. For what? For all of it. For what you've been through. For what I've put you through. She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. You don't seem like the other men. What other men? The ones who came to look at me before. They were different, hungry. You just seem sad. The observation cut deep because it was true. Jacob was sad. Sad for the life he had never been able to build, sad for the loneliness that had driven him to this point, and now sad for the girl who had been caught up in his desperation. I never meant for it to be like this, he said. I don't know what I... You thought you were buying a wife, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Someone to cook and clean and warm your bed. Someone who wouldn't leave. The blunt assessment made Jacob flinch. Yes, he admitted. I suppose I did. And now? Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the commodity he had purchased, but a young woman who had been forced to grow up too fast, who had survived things that would have broken stronger people. Now I think I made a terrible mistake, he said, and I need to find a way to make it. Something shifted in Sarah's expression, a cautious hope that she quickly tried to suppress. What does that mean? I don't know yet, Jacob said honestly, but we'll figure it out together. As they walked back toward the house, the sun climbed higher in the sky, burning off the morning mist and revealing the true scope of the land around. It was beautiful in its starkness, this corner of Wyoming where the earth met the sky in an endless embrace. Sarah walked beside him now instead of behind him, and Jacob took that as a small victory. There would be many more battles ahead, against the law, against society, against their own damaged hearts, but for the first time since the black sedan had driven away, Jacob felt something that might have been hope. The transaction had been completed, the papers signed, the money exchanged, but the real work was just beginning, the work of learning to trust, to heal, to find a way forward that honored both their humanity and their impossible situation. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but they were no longer facing it alone. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival at the ranch, and a fragile routine had begun to emerge from the chaos of their first encounter. Each morning, Jacob would wake to the sound of movement in the kitchen below, and each evening they would sit across from each other at the small table, sharing meals in a silence that had grown less oppressive with time. Sarah had transformed the neglected house in small but meaningful ways. The windows sparkled with cleanliness, wildflowers from the prairie appeared in mason jars on the windowsills, and the smell of fresh bread often filled the air. She worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned early that usefulness was a form of protection, but Jacob began to notice something else in her movements, a kind of cautious pride in what she was creating. The legal reality of their situation hung over them like a storm cloud. The marriage certificate bore both their names, signed in Sarah's careful handwriting and Jacob's bold scrawl. To the outside world, they were husband and wife, a fact that made Jacob's stomach turn every time he thought about it. But inside the walls of the ranch house, they were simply two damaged people trying to figure out how to coexist. On this particular morning, Jacob found Sarah sitting on the front porch, her knees drawn up to her chest as she watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. She had discovered this ritual in her second week, and he had learned not to disturb her during these quiet moments. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, settling into the chair beside her. She nodded, not taking her eyes off the horizon. "I never saw sunrises like this in the city. The buildings were always in the way." It was more than she usually volunteered, and Jacob felt a small surge of... Their conversations had been growing longer, more natural, as if she were slowly remembering how to trust her own voice. "Tell me about the city," he said. "What was it like?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Jacob thought she might retreat back into silence. Then she began to speak, her voice soft but steady. "Loud," she said. "Always loud. Cars and sirens and people." The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there was this family downstairs who fought all the time. Their baby would cry, and the walls were so thin you could hear everything. She paused, pulling her knees closer to her chest. "My mother worked nights mostly, so I was alone a lot. I learned to be quiet, to not cause problems. The neighbors complained if we made too much noise, and we couldn't afford to get evicted." Jacob listened without interrupting, understanding that this was the first time she had shared any real details about her past. He could picture her as a child, learning to make herself small and invisible, carrying responsibilities that should have belonged to the adults around her. "What about?" he asked gently. A shadow crossed her face. "I went sometimes, when there was enough money for supplies, when I didn't have to watch the other kids. When my mother wasn't..." She trailed off, not finishing the sentence. "When your mother wasn't what?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him with the truth. when she wasn't too sick to take care of herself. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jacob didn't push for more details, but he could see the weight of old secrets in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Don't be," Sarah replied, her voice firmer now. "It wasn't your fault, and it's over now." But Jacob could see that it wasn't over, not real. The past lived in the way she flinched when he moved too quickly, in the way she hoarded food as if she wasn't sure when the next meal would come, in the way she sometimes seemed to disappear inside herself when the weight of memory became too much. Later that morning, Jacob was working in the barn when he heard a commotion from the chicken coop. He rushed outside to find Sarah standing in the dirt, her face flushed with anger, while a red-faced man in a sheriff's uniform towered over her. "What's going on here?" Jacob demanded, stepping between them. "Sheriff Morrison," the man said, not taking his eyes off Sarah. "Got a call about a disturbance. Seems your wife and was causing trouble at the general." Jacob looked at Sarah, who was staring at the ground, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What kind of trouble?" Jacob asked. "Mrs. Henderson says she caught her stealing," the sheriff replied. "Candy bars and such. Said she tried to run when she was confronted." "I wasn't stealing," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not what Henderson says," the sheriff continued. "She wants to press charges unless you make this right." Jacob felt a surge of protective anger. "What exactly does she want?" $50 for damages and a public apology. "And she wants your wife to stay away from the store." The amount was outrageous for a few candy bars, but Jacob could see the real motivation behind the demand. Small towns thrived on gossip, and the story of the older rancher and his young bride had obviously made the rounds. This was about power, about putting them in their place. "Fine," Jacob said, pulling out his wallet. "But I want to hear what really happened." The sheriff took the money and left with a warning about keeping better control of his house. Jacob waited until the man's car disappeared down the dirt road before turning to Sarah. "Now," he said gently, "tell me what really happened." Sarah's composure cracked, and tears began to stream down her cheeks. "I wasn't stealing," she said. "I had money. I had the money you gave me for supplies." "Then what happened?" "Mrs. Henderson, she said things. About us. About—" Sarah's voice broke. "She said everyone knew what I was, that I was just a bought woman, no better than a—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Jacob felt his blood boil. The cruelty of small-town gossip had always disgusted him, but this was different. This was a direct attack on someone who couldn't defend herself. "What did you do?" he asked. I told her I wasn't what she thought I was, but she kept saying it louder and louder until other people started staring. So I left the candy on the counter and ran." Jacob pulled her into his arms without thinking, and for a moment she let herself be held. He could feel her trembling against him, the weight of shame and anger and fear all mixed. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly. "Not one damn thing. But everyone thinks—" "I don't care what everyone thinks," Jacob interrupted. "I care what you think. I care what I think. And I think you're the strongest person I've ever met." Sarah pulled back to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You survived 15 years in hell and came out the other side with your humanity intact. You take care of this house like it's something precious. You make me want to be better than I am. If that's not strength, I don't know what is." Something shifted in Sarah's expression, a crack in the armor she wore to protect herself from the... For the first time since her arrival, she looked at him not as a captor or a stranger, but as someone who might actually see her as more than the sum of her circumstances. "I don't know how to be strong," she admitted. "You don't have to know," Jacob said. "You just have to keep being yourself." That evening they sat on the porch again, watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky. The silence between them was different now, charged with the electricity of shared secrets and growing trust. "Jacob," Sarah said, her voice small in the vastness of the night. "Yeah? When you bought me, what did you expect?" It was a question he had been dreading, but also one he knew she deserved an honest answer. "I expected someone who would cook and clean and not ask questions," he said. "Someone who would make the loneliness go away without requiring anything real from me. And now—" Jacob turned to look at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. "Now I think I was an idiot, and I think you deserve so much better than what I offered. What if I said I wanted to—" The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Jacob felt his heart skip a beat, but he forced himself to think clearly. "You're 15, Sarah. You don't know what you want yet." "I know what I don't want," she said fiercely. "I don't want to go back to the city. I don't want to be hungry all the time. I don't want to be afraid of every man who looks—" "And what do you want?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was steady and sure. I want to learn things. I want to read books and maybe go to school. I want to help with the ranch and make this place beautiful. I want to be someone who matters." "You already matter," Jacob said quietly. "Not like I want to matter because of who I am, not because of what I can do for other people." The conversation continued late into the night, two souls finding common ground in the space between what they had been and what they might become. By the time they finally went inside, something fundamental had shifted in their relation. Jacob lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the feelings churning inside him. He had bought Sarah expecting a transaction, but what he had found was something infinitely more complicated and precious, a person with dreams and fears and a will to survive that humbled him. In the room upstairs, Sarah sat by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. For the first time in her life, she felt like she might have a future worth fighting for. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with legal and emotional obstacles that seemed insurmountable, but she was no longer facing it alone. The lonely rancher and the girl sold by her mother had found something neither of them had expected, the beginning of. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. As Jacob stood in the barn, his hands shaking as he held the official-looking envelope that had arrived that morning. The return address read, "Child Protective Services," and his stomach had dropped the moment he saw it. 2 months had passed since Sarah's arrival, and their unconventional arrangement had settled into something that felt almost normal. She had started studying with books Jacob ordered from catalogues, her hunger for knowledge both touching and heartbreaking. The lonely ranch house had become a home, filled with the sound of her laughter and the warmth of genuine companionship. But Jacob had always known this day would come. "Jacob?" Sarah's voice came from the doorway, concern evident in her tone. "What's wrong?" He turned to face her, seeing the way the afternoon light caught the gold highlights in her dark hair. She had grown in the past months, not just physically, but emotionally. The hollow-eyed girl who had arrived in that black sedan had been replaced by someone who stood straighter, spoke with confidence, and looked at the world with curiosity rather than fear. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with dread. They sat at the kitchen table, the envelope between them like a weapon waiting to explode. Jacob had opened it before coming to find her, and the contents had shattered the fragile peace they had built. "They're coming," he said simply. "Tomorrow. Someone reported our situation." Sarah's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "Who? Does it matter? Half the town knows by now. Henderson at the store, Sheriff Morrison, any number of people who think they know what's best for you. And what do they think is best?" Jacob looked at the letter again, even though he had already memorized every word. "Foster care, a group home until they can find a suitable family. They want to dissolve our marriage and press charges against me for—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "For what?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising. "For giving me a home, for treating me like a human being?" "For marrying a child," Jacob said quietly. "For being part of a system that traffics in human beings." The words hung in the air between them, brutal in their honesty. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. "I won't go," she said fiercely. "I won't let them You might not have a choice. There's always a choice." Sarah's eyes blazed with determination. "I could run. I could hide. I could—" "You could get hurt," Jacob interrupted. "Or worse. Sarah, these people have the law on their side. They have resources I don't have, and honestly, maybe they're right." Sarah stopped pacing and stared at him. "What do you—" Jacob stood and moved to the window, looking out at the land that had been his sanctuary for so many years. "Maybe this was all a mistake. Maybe I was selfish to bring you here. Maybe you would be better off with people who can give you a normal life." "A normal life?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "Jacob, I've never had a normal— I've never had anyone who cared whether I lived or died. I've never had anyone who listened to me, who helped me learn, who made me feel like I mattered." "You're 15, Jacob said, turning back to face her. "You should be in school, making friends, dating boys your own age. You should be worried about homework and prom dresses, not playing house with a broken-down rancher who bought you like livestock." "Stop it," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "Stop talking about me like I don't have a say in my own life. I'm not a child anymore. I haven't been a child since I was 8 years old, and my mother started leaving me alone for days at a time." The pain in her voice cut through Jacob's self-recrimination. He had seen glimpses of her past trauma, but she had never spoken about it so directly. "Tell me," he said gently. "Tell me what happened to you." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My mother was addicted to pills. Prescription drugs at first, then whatever she could. She would disappear for days, sometimes weeks, I learned to take care of myself, to forge her signature on school forms, to lie to the social workers when they came around. Jacob felt his heart breaking for the child she had been, forced to become an adult before she was ready. When I was 12, she started bringing men home, different men, always different. They would pay her and she would let them stay. Some of them, Sarah's voice broke, some of them looked at me in ways that made my skin crawl. I learned to hide, to make myself invisible. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I got good at it, she continued, as if she hadn't heard him. Being invisible, being useful without being known. When my mother said she had found someone who would take care of me, who would give me a better life, I thought it was just another lie. But then I met you. She turned to look at him, tears streaming down her face. You never touched me. You never demanded anything from me. You gave me my own room, my own space. You treated me like a person, not a thing to be used. That's the bare minimum of human decency, Jacob said. That's not something you should have to be grateful for. Maybe not, Sarah agreed. But it's more than I ever had before. And now you want to give me up to people who will put me in a system that failed me once already? Jacob sank back into his chair, the weight of their situation crushing down on him. I don't know what else. If they take you away, at least you'll be safe. At least you'll have a chance at a real life. This is my real life, Sarah said, her voice fierce with conviction. This ranch, this house, this is the first real life I've ever had. I'm not going to let them take it away from me. What are you suggesting? Sarah sat back down at the table, her eyes bright with determination. I'm suggesting we fight. I'm suggesting we tell our story, the real story, not the version they've made up in their heads. Sarah, I bought you. I paid money for you. No amount of explanation is going to change that fact. No, Sarah said, but it might change how people see it. You didn't buy me for sex or slavery. You bought me out of loneliness. And I stayed because I found something here I never had before. Respect, kindness, hope. Jacob looked at her, seeing the strength that had carried her through 15 years of neglect and abuse. You really want to fight this? I want to fight for this, Sarah corrected. For us, for what we've built here. It won't be easy. The whole town will be talking. The newspapers might pick up the story. You'll have to testify, to tell strangers about your past. I'm not afraid of the truth, Sarah said. Are you? Jacob considered the question. The truth was complicated, messy, and would likely be misunderstood by many, but it was also the only weapon they had against the system that wanted to tear them apart. No, he said. I'm not afraid of the truth. That evening, Jacob called the one lawyer he knew in town, a man named David Phillips, who had helped him with land disputes in the past. Phillips listened to their story with growing amazement, asking pointed questions about the circumstances of their arrangement and the nature of their relationship. This is unprecedented, Phillips said when Jacob finished. I've never seen anything like it. The legal implications alone. Can you help us? Jacob asked. I can try, but you need to understand what you're up against. The state has a compelling interest in protecting children. Even if your relationship is completely innocent, the fact remains that you entered into a marriage contract with a minor through what amounts to human trafficking. So we don't have a chance. I didn't say that, but it's going to take more than just your word against theirs. We'll need character witnesses, evidence of Sarah's well-being, proof that she's better off now than she was before. The next morning, Jacob and Sarah waited on the front porch as two cars pulled up to them. The first held a social worker named Janet Martinez, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to making life-changing decisions about other people's lives. The second car held Sheriff Morrison and another deputy. Mr. Harrison, Martinez said, approaching the porch with a folder in her. I'm here to conduct a welfare check on Sarah Chen and to discuss the future of this arrangement. She's Sarah Harrison now, Jacob said quietly. Legally. Yes, well, that's part of what we need to discuss. Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. I'm right here. If you want to talk about my future, you can talk. Martinez looked at her with surprise, as if she hadn't expected the girl to speak for herself. Of course, Sarah, I'm Janet Martinez from Child Protective Services. I'm here to help you. Help me do what? Help you understand your options. Help you transition to a more appropriate living situation. What if I don't want to transition? Martinez's expression softened slightly. Honey, I know this might be the only life you've known for the past few months, but you deserve so much more. You deserve to be with people your own age, to go to school, to have the childhood you were denied. I don't want a childhood, Sarah said firmly. I want the life I'm building here. You're 15 years old. You don't know what I know what I don't want, Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger. I don't want to go back to being shuffled around by adults who think they know what's best for me without ever bothering to ask what I think. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Martinez asking probing questions about their living arrangements, their relationship, and Sarah's well-being. Jacob answered honestly, knowing that any deception would only make things worse. Sarah spoke with a maturity and articulateness that clearly surprised the social worker. When it was over, Martinez stood to leave, but her expression was troubled. "I'll be submitting my report to the court," she said. "There will be a hearing next week to determine Sarah's custody." "And until then?" Jacob asked. "Until then she stays here, but Mr. Harrison, I strongly advise you to prepare for the possibility that this arrangement will be terminated." After the officials left, Jacob and Sarah sat in the quiet kitchen, the weight of the coming battle settling around them like a shroud. "Do you think we have a chance, Sarah?" Jacob looked at her, seeing not the frightened girl who had arrived months ago, but a young woman who had found her voice and was determined to use it. "I think we have something worth fighting for," he said, "and sometimes that's enough."